Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much. How's everyone doing? Good. Very good. Very good. So, pump up your coaching. You always try to come up with a fancy title with some nice fonts, so hopefully this does the trick. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, but to be honest, I was probably not in the headspace 3 or 4 years to present on this. So I've spent the last 3 years working on my own fitness and my own coaching and muscularity and all that fun stuff. I finally said, you know what, Nick, let's finally do this. And the reason is I've been talking about talking for a very long time, okay? I think the first time I ever did a podcast on cueing was back in 2008, 2009, and I started thinking about the topic probably around 2007. And so for me, I've always had an interest in the space between us and our clients, us and our patients, us and our athletes. Whatever occupation, whatever little corner of this great industry you work in, we're talking about you. Because for me, what I've always found is we spend a lot of time, even if you, and this isn't a critique, but if you look at the agenda, many talks, whether it's Perform Better or otherwise, really emphasize the what of coaching. What do we do? So drills, exercises, biomechanics, programming, periodization, and all of that is necessary. That's the wood, the nails at the build site. If we don't have those things, there's nothing to assemble. But if I have wood and nails and a hammer, but I don't know how to swing that hammer, I don't know the art of coaching, I don't know how to get the ideas out of my head and, so to speak, into your body, then I still run up with a house I can no longer move into. And so for me, this has been the space that I'm curious. And it covers a lot of domains of science. So if you ever read anything in motor learning, skill acquisition, psychology, educational psychology in particular, those are all the various scientific disciplines I pull from. My PhD, just to give you the background, is in motor learning. And I specifically have spent most of my career studying how we can communicate movement better. And that's specific things like sprinting, change of direction, all the various complex movements we see on the field. And so while I'm a strength coach for over 20 years, this has been, so to speak, the corner. And I keep speaking on it because I feel it's the area that keeps on giving. You know, inevitably you can learn periodization, you can learn program design, and while there's variation, it operates on very fixed principles for the most part. When it comes to cueing and coaching and communication, every new person you meet, and even meeting the same person again for the first time the next day, usually presents itself with a different challenge. The cue that worked on Monday might not work 3 months from now, right? The cue that works for client A does nothing. In fact, it might make client B worse. And so the ability to get at the first principles of how we can get better, at the how of coaching, is everything. And so I have spent a long time talking about movement skill, talking about the science. I haven't spent as much time talking about its application in the weight room. And specifically, the area I get the most questions on is when it comes to bodybuilding. Now here I'm not talking about bodybuilding in terms of Arnold, even though I'm going to use a lot of that imagery throughout this. And again, I was at Venice Beach, I went to the Golds, I was primed up for today. Right? They are models, so to speak, inspiration, but here I'm talking about literally the act of building the body. And if you've ever heard me speak in the past, many of you have not, I want you to think of this talk as a metaphor for all movement. Even though I will be focusing primarily on things we do in the weight room, isolated movements even involving machines, I don't want that to deter you. The principles of how we communicate and how the way we think impacts the way we move, these are universal principles that I'm pointing to. And so you should be able to find application even if none of the movements I go through today are things you coach on a day-to-day basis. And so ultimately what I want to tackle with this is where nuances in the science meet hypertrophy and actually developing muscularity, because oftentimes if you're familiar with this space, we'll talk about this concept and I'll review it momentarily around external cues. And how many of you are just generally familiar with this idea of internal cues versus external cues? Raise your hand. Okay, so I'd say about half the room. If you're not familiar with that, basically what we're talking about is what you think while you move. And the question is usually, okay, should I think about my body while I move my body, such as, okay, squeeze my biceps in a bicep curl. That's a really simple one. That's an internal cue. It's inside the body. Or should I think about the outcome the body is trying to achieve? Okay, I'm focusing on lifting the barbell. That is, drum roll, an external. It's outside of the body. That's really the simplicity of it. People have asked that question. They've asked it hundreds of times in the research across all sorts of different populations. And they keep coming back that external cues tend to be better for a whole host of things. And I'm going to cover that later on. However, when I have a bodybuilder in the room or someone who's read a lot of the research, like, well, hold on, doesn't internal cues, when I think about my bicep, like my bicep burns and there's increased EMG. I know that was a study I read. Isn't that activation matter? Or, hey, when I'm rehabbing and I need to do isolated muscle activity, should I not be thinking about internal cues? And I've been waving my external cue wand and continue to promote external. But funny enough, today I really want to talk about external, but also internal cueing. When and how can we skillfully think about the body while we move the body? And that's why I'm excited about this, because there are a few faces in here that have heard me talk, and I haven't addressed it from this angle. So I think what I'm trying to do, with now 20 years, I'm trying to continue to color the nuance of this topic, because as much as we like to make things black and white, they rarely are. So I think this is going to improve the fidelity of the topic of attentional focus, today specifically applied to building muscle. Okay? So how many of you are familiar with this as a concept, the mind-muscle connection? Okay? So a lot of this would have come out of pumping iron. A lot of this has come out of bodybuilding and bodybuilding folklore. There's a number of papers, recent papers, that have this in the title, talking about the mind-muscle connection. And when you think of it in a bodybuilding perspective, and Jay Cutler is one of my favorite bodybuilders, 4-time Mr. Olympia, he says if you're in the gym, you're a bodybuilder. And I agree with that. So he's talking about if you're in there working your body, working your muscles, the mind-muscle connection is basically how do I connect with this muscle to either get the greatest level of activation or the greatest level of function. I think that's a nice way to put it. For me, I normally talk about function, functional movement, sprinting, change of direction, effectiveness, coordination. And so here now today we're really talking about mind-muscle connection in terms of activation. How can I get that muscle to do the most high-quality work within the programming constraints I have presented within it? That's where we're going to look at this intersection. And from a bodybuilding perspective, it's all about the pump. It's all about the inflation. It's all about that sense that the muscle has done the work. Evidence of future outcomes is what I say. Evidence of future outcomes. Now, some people don't like the feeling of a pump or a soreness, but a lot of people do. It gives them the immediate knowledge that this was working. And it's a pretty good way to go about it. If a muscle feels that it is expanded in volume, it feels tighter, it feels fatigued, it's a good sign that we probably hit it. And I'm sure a lot of you, when you're doing, let's say, back, for example, you'll have individuals who have been doing back exercises all their life and have never actually felt their back pump up. They've never actually felt their shoulders become full. There's simple things like biceps and calves and quads. Everyone can nail those. But there's a lot of muscle groups that people struggle to activate. And I'm going to argue today that a lot of that does not come down to the muscle. It comes down to the muscle between our ears. It comes down to the way we're thinking about the movement while we're moving that is impacting, increasing, or decreasing our likelihood of getting that mind-muscle connection. And so in a lot of ways, I don't want to get in front of myself. I think I'm going to start to articulate fairly objectively what the mind-muscle connection is and how you go about achieving it, literally for any movement with which that is an interest to you. And again, that interest is you are trying to increase high-quality, localized muscle activation, likely in pursuit of hypertrophy, whether it be function-based or aesthetic-based. That's kind of the world I'm operating today. So I don't want anyone to assume anything I don't say or don't talk about I disagree with, which oftentimes can be the case in a presentation. So we'll start here with Arnie. It is the mind that creates the body. It is the mind that visualizes what the body ought to look like. So he meant this from two different perspectives. One, he had a very strong visual of what he wanted to look like. Joe Weider, especially if you watch his documentary on Prime, which is wonderful, this ability to visualize what the human form looks like, I think played a lot into the way they visualize their ability to create that future muscle while they performed the activity. And for any of you that were in my practical this morning, we actually, I think, brought that to life quite successfully, playing around with different thought processes and seeing how they differentially impacted directly in the moment my ability to feel and thus know in the future develop adaptation within my body. And so that's where the mind comes in. But how often do we talk about this? You know, if we just say, well, just think about your bicep, well, what does that mean? Like, should I look at it? Well, they do that. Okay. Should I feel it? Like, how should I feel it? Like, am I feeling it by squeezing my hand? Because think about that. When I say squeeze your bicep, what do a lot of you, boom, you grab an apple from an apple tree, right? You start crushing potato chips. Like, well, hold on, is that what thinking about my bicep is? But my bicep is here. So how do we actually do that? And for those of us in this industry, I think we have to understand, I think we walk into this with a huge bias. I've rarely met someone who's become a coach, a trainer, a physical therapist that doesn't tend to have pretty good body awareness. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but rarely do you have someone that gets in, let alone stays in this industry, that doesn't like physical stuff themselves. Have you ever met someone, clients, that that's not the case? And so we inadvertently, this is a mistake in coaching in general, we inadvertently think because it makes sense to us, it will make sense to them. And it's a bias in all of human communication. That's why we're like, don't you understand what I mean? Well, obviously not. That's why their face is all shriveled up. This isn't just in coaching, this is in life. And so the key thing for me is what are the mechanisms to help the person that doesn't understand at first blush inevitably come to that common understanding that you currently own yourself, okay? So mind-muscle connection, focus by muscle growth. How does this thing actually work? Before I can get into that, I want to build on what I said earlier about internal versus external cues. I want to provide us with a continuum of the different ways your mind can work while you lift. And here I'm providing categories that I haven't provided before because they're very specific to what we might do in the weight room for this type of activity. The line is going to represent the top portion, internal cues, anything that invites you to think about your body, versus external cues. And I'll talk about some nuance here as we go. So the first one is this. I can offer someone an internal focus that is very joint-based. Okay, I want you to flex or extend your joint. And we might say, I want you to flex your elbow. I want you to flex your shoulder. I want you to extend your knee. It's not very sexy language. I'd argue that all of us have probably used it, but rarely is it the cue that you are going to cash in at the bank. Is it fair to say that normally when you use that kind of language, you're describing the activity to the client? Is that fair to say? Just nod your head if you agree with that. Right? So you're giving them basically biomechanical descriptions. This goes here, that goes there, so on and so forth. Do we agree that that's not the same as cueing? It could be for some. They might say, hey, you need to extend your knee, and that's the beginning, the middle, and the end of their story. But I think we all recognize that in time, that cue will run its course. And so there are some people that use just biomechanical description as the way they coach, but I think a lot of you will recognize that that's a good way to generally develop understanding of the movement, but knowing what to do and knowing how to do it, are they the same? Have you ever had the client say to you, I know what to do? You've told me many times, I just don't know how to do it? So this first category of cue is very what heavy, isn't it? It's describing what should happen. Well, you need to hit that nail with the hammer over there. It doesn't make me skilled at wielding the hammer. And so I think this is very important for us to recognize. So it's an and, not an or. This is important. I need to have this in my language toolbox. But if this is where your language ends, I think that the clientele you'll be able to support to the degree you want to support them is going to be very, very limited. And you might get away on having a good personality, good at programming, but you are in a massive gap in terms of your ability to make and influence them from a coaching perspective. Okay? Second category now is an internal focus on the muscle. So this starts to introduce a little bit more of the function of the target area. So here I might say, hey, I want you to think about squeezing your pecs or squeezing your shoulders or squeezing your biceps or squeezing your glutes. Right? These are all examples. And when we give these cues, they tend to be single muscle oriented. Even if it's a multi-joint movement, you're inviting them to put their energy, if you think of the mind like a spotlight, put the spotlight on a certain region of the body to increase its activation. Is it fair to say that all of you at some point or another will use cues like that? We all do it. I do it as well. Absolutely. The third and final one, and I've never presented this version of it, is what I refer to as an internal focus that is an analogy. So I might say, hey, as you're driving up, okay, I know I want the elbows to come together. If the elbows come together, that means the pecs and the anterior delta are shortening. Great, that's what I want. Okay, how can I increase the energy towards helping them do that better? I want you to imagine you have a spring between your elbows, and I want you to compress that spring as you bring your arms up. And if they're going too fast, I might say, hey, I need a thicker spring, okay? I want you to have one of those 4x4 springs. So I can even play with this visual idea with the client to have them feel the energy a little bit more and, so to speak, hack their way backdoor into feeling, oh, do you feel your, yeah, I feel the pec so much more. Awesome. So we have these three categories. As we get down to this internal focus by analogy, I'm going to argue that the cue becomes more functional. I'm going from what to do to how to do it. Because in my mind, I can imagine what compressing a spring might feel like, what it might look like. It puts a strong visual. And so now, even though I'm bench pressing, I have this kind of sub-activity within the bench press to help me do it better. There's something I can do with the cue. There's something I can do with the cue. That makes it very how-based. But I can keep going now. I can take you out of the body completely, and now I can give you an external focus that is close to you. And so now I can start to say, hey, I want you to drive the barbell away from the ground, or I want you to drive the barbell away from the bench. Again, this is going to activate the same muscles, but I would argue if you go to the gym tonight and play around with the first 3 reps, imagine you have the spring between the elbows, spring, 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 and then the next 3 reps, bar, bar, bar. I will bet a large sum of money that those do not feel the same. It's like trying on Adidas and Nike. They're kind of similar, but they're not the same, okay? And so when we look at this, we'll get to what the difference is and why one might leave you with more of a pump sense and the other one might feel more function, tension, weight-based. I can then extend my focus farther away. I can say, I want you to drive the barbell up to the ceiling. Why would I do that? Well, driving it away from the bench still keeps my energy very close to my body, but if I'm lifting a heavy weight, I might try to get it off me. So extending my focus farther away might make the distance and the completeness of the motion more salient, more obvious to me. And I'm sure even if you think about it, you've played around with these different cues. Naturally, if you want more power from someone, say a kettlebell swing, you don't say snap the kettlebell up, you say snap it at the wall. So we innately have this inbuilt sense that even though the kettlebell isn't leaving my body, if I happen to swing it as if it was and I was to let it go towards the wall, I'd probably get more power. But in holding on to it, I just get a faster motion. So a lot of our language, you're probably like, I do that. Yeah, you do that, and there's a reason you do it, but do you know that you do it? Do you do it by chance or choice? I'm trying to move us to the second one, okay? And then the final one, and I'm going to keep with the analogy, and I guarantee whether it be a push-up or a bench press, you've all tried this. Now I've moved the spring from the elbows up to the bar. And literally there's a German company that makes a bar like this, that literally has springs, and you can create a dynamic abduction-adduction motion while you're doing conventional barbell work. Kind of cool. But here now, if I literally imagine I'm putting tension in on the bar as if to compress a spring, it's external focused, it's getting that inward motion, but now I'm going to see heightened activation here. And so literally if you went and did all 6 of these cues, you're going to get overlap, but a slightly different feeling. The question is, how can I differentially use these to get the most out of the movement? But even if you use different cues, what's cool about this continuum is it allows you to ensure that every time your client meets that movement, they meet it for the first time again. They meet it for the first time again. Because so much of what we do, by necessity, is mundane. Like, how do you make brushing your teeth any more exciting than doing it? Yet you have to, or at least you should do it a few times a day. Same thing in our industry. Same thing. And so what I find, without being fake or artificial, what we are trying to do is think of the activity and the athlete as a couple, right? And we're trying to improve their connection together. We're like couples therapists, and the way we utilize cues improves that connection exponentially and the outcomes the person hopes to achieve. So is it fair to say, as you look at this continuum of cues, you, so to speak, surf this continuum? You probably say things that fall along the entire wave. Absolutely. And so what I'm going to try to do today is to put it into context, how to get the balance of using these when we're in the weight room. I promised a little bit of research here. If you're going to read one paper on this and you kind of want to get right to the point, this would be the paper that I recommend. So, Superiority of External Attentional Focus for Motor Performance and Learning, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. This was done back, I think, in 2002, 2003. It went through all of the research since 1998, and it clearly outlines that when it comes to things like strength, power, speed, coordination, function, an external cue again and again and again not only results in better performance immediately, but better learning and longevity long term. And it does so across gender, across age, across ability. Okay, so this is a universal principle. When you drive your car, if you don't focus on the road, you're not going to be driving that car for very long. Okay? When you're thirsty, you don't call upon the fibers in your deltoid and your bicep to go get the water. No, you reach out, grab it, and you quench your thirst. Our default position is to focus externally. That's because this entire thing is a symphony, and that external focus is the conductor. Okay, so the vast majority of activity requires us to be out here in the world. But when it comes to building muscle, there are some opportunities under the safe context of the type of lift to bring our attention a bit more inward, and that's what we're going to talk about. And so ultimately and objectively, this is what we know. If my goal is strength, if I want to increase the amount of weight I lift, I want to think externally or be in an external state of mind using those bottom three categories I presented. If I want to improve my power, if I want to improve my speed of movement, whether it's barbell or me just over land, I want to be in an external state of mind. If I want greater endurance, I don't want my muscularity to fail as quickly. I want to be in an external state of mind. So these are the three major, in terms of strength-based tenets, that we see again and again and again. So what is it then that an internal cue does? Well, an internal cue, simply put, increases the EMG. It increases the actual activation of the muscle. The reason it does that is when you think about a muscle and not a movement, when you think about a muscle and not a movement, you get a very imprecise neural drive out to that region, and everything in that region tends to activate. That's why typically under an internal focus you see higher activation, but you see it both in the agonist and the antagonist. So everything in the general region just lights up. It's a blunt instrument when it comes to coaching somebody how to move. But when you are doing simpler, more isolated, or more stability-enhanced, i.e. machine-based work, you can actually use it to get a significantly higher localized activation and fatiguing effect. And when you actually look at the signaling in muscle hypertrophy, that's actually a pretty good way to get certain forms of muscularity and muscle hypertrophy within the context of a broader program. And so this is why individuals like Brad Schoenfeld, who has written a very nice textbook, I think it's in its second edition, on hypertrophy. He's one of the top kind of academic consultants in the bodybuilding space, probably the largest scientific voice on hypertrophy. He was interested in this. And so I was involved in this study more from a consulting perspective, which is why my name is way down the list. But he actually took a group of individuals and asked the question, internal versus external, does an internal cue actually result in greater muscle hypertrophy, greater muscular growth? What they found is, and I can't remember the exact activities, I think it was a bicep curl and a leg extension, but it was an upper body and a lower body. What they found is in the lower body, it didn't make a difference, internal versus external. And if you think about that, how often have you done your back squat? You're like, oh, I'm going to squeeze my quads. You do not do it. Now, if you do a leg extension or a leg curl where now it's isolated, obvious, and unavoidable, that's different. But when it comes to multi-joint lower body movements, it's a symphony. There's too many things going on, and the activation profile based on the range of motion is changing so rapidly. To think about one muscle through that is just not as easy to do than, let's say, the pecs when you're doing a bench press. And so the biomechanical general differences in the lower body, I think, are one of the reasons why we saw that. But when I talk later about single joint stuff, a leg extension and a leg curl might present different opportunities to reboot the value of an internal cue. On the upper body front, though, it did show a general bias towards an internal cue, resulting in a larger circumference change. Okay, so it signaled towards greater hypertrophy from utilizing the internal focus in these more isolated, smaller muscle groups in the upper body. And so this is the paper anyone who is familiar with this research will point to oftentimes to say, well, what about internal cueing for hypertrophy? Which then leads us to a very, very important question, right? Well, how does hypertrophy type impact the type of cues we use? Because not all hypertrophy is created equal. So hypertrophy type can possibly shed a bit of light on how we best use internal versus external focus. It's funny how a career works out, but I wrote a paper on this nearly 17 years ago, okay, around this concept of functional versus non-functional hypertrophy. I don't really like the title, but I'm still going to use the terminology. So what does it mean? This research comes out of the 70s and the 80s, where they were doing a lot of muscle biopsy work in powerlifters and bodybuilders. And so with the muscle biopsy, they were able to go in and look at the relative ratio of muscle fibers, the actual fibers that do the heavy lifting, right, versus the non-myofibrillar, it's a mouthful, related tissue, the connective tissue that's also involved, gives the structure, the scaffolding to the muscle. And so what they found is powerlifters, no surprise, seem to have a higher bias towards muscle fiber hypertrophy, whereas bodybuilders seem to have a greater bias towards more of the sarcoplasmic or connective tissue. And when you think about that, well, bodybuilders are doing higher volume that doesn't necessarily always maximally stress from a tension perspective the tissue. Whereas what is a powerlifter doing? They're constantly putting their body under massive maximal muscular tension. So the actual tissue structures, one is just trying to give integrity to last the race, and the other one is trying to give a maximal output of force production. And that was started to form some of the basic understanding and rationale of why hypertrophy might bias one versus the other. Obviously, bodybuilders, especially enhanced bodybuilders, are ridiculously strong, but they're not as strong as powerlifters, right? So take that for what it is, but understand there is a difference. It's not saying bodybuilders cannot still be strong. And so what we find then is when you are trying to develop what has been referred to as functional hypertrophy, hypertrophy that improves function, and in this case, function is my ability to express and generate greater force, as would be the case in a powerlifter, that using high mechanical load, heavy weights, moderate to lower volume, tend to result in the hypertrophy of the actual tissue structures, the muscle tissue struggles. This is called myofibrillar hypertrophy, the myofibers. Versus non-functional hypertrophy is all the stuff around those fibers. Hence the reason it's typically called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Non-functional is just an easier way to put it. So if your function is aesthetics, then the terminology goes out the door. But if we're talking about this in terms of athletes, which is where I was coming from when I wrote this, the type of hypertrophy and the way I was chasing it mattered, this would be less functional for a person. Ultimately, we want both, right? We probably want to build integrity early in an off season. This is classically what we do with GPP, general physical preparation, higher volume, building anatomical adaptation, Bompa would say. And as we get closer to the event, right, we want to start to build this function, this ability to generate force, power under higher mechanical stress. Ultimately, in our context, both can matter. That's actually not what today's presentation is on. Already, if I tell you about internal versus external cueing, do you have an intuition on which one I would use for which type of hypertrophy? if I'm trying to do functional hypertrophy, maximize mechanical stress, lift as much weight as possible, internal or external? External. All day long. You will cash that check at the bank, okay? If I'm trying to go for non-functional hypertrophy, moderate to higher volume, I'm trying to put more metabolic stress, I'm trying to get the pump, I'm trying to get the lactic acid, I'm trying to get the fatigue, I'm trying to douse this thing in all the bioenergetic byproducts of lifting weights and have that chemical composition stimulate downstream hypertrophy, do you think I want to go with external or internal? Probably either. Probably either. Okay, but the key is internal starts to get a seat at the table. That's the point. Over here, internal starts to get a seat at the table. That's why this is more of a bodybuilder themed, because that tends to be germane to how bodybuilders go about developing their muscularity, but it still plays a role in the general adaptation and the general performance of our athletes. And so, the type of focus then should match the desired stimulus adaptation you seek to achieve. I think this is a very simple way to now start taking hypertrophy type and focus type and bringing them together. So here's some of my first recommendations. Okay, number one, an external focus is best for conditions involving maximal mechanical stress under heavy loading and or high fatigue. So what I mean by high fatigue is you might be doing sets of 10 to 15, but by the time you get to those last few repetitions and coordination starts to fail, guess what cue state of mind I think you should be in? You probably should pivot yourself into an external focus to make sure you can grind out those reps with the harmonization of all your mechanical resources. Because again, internal focus is a blunt instrument. It's non-precise, which is why it's less effective for multi-joint coordination for things like sprinting. So even if I'm on a leg press, I might be quads. But if I want those last 3 reps and I need to get myself out of the hole, guess where I'm going, right? Platform. So that's what I mean by high fatigue, okay? An external focus is the preferred focus during multi-joint movements, notably when using free weights, okay? So again, if coordination is the rate limiter in the activity, and let's be honest, a lot of bodybuilders are not doing coordination-limited activities very often, you want to keep them in an external state of mind. It's like going to a symphony and only having the flute section play when you use an internal cue. Okay? When you use an external cue, it's a conductor. It allows the entire series of muscles and joints to harmonize and work together to achieve a singular outcome. That's what an external cue is. Whereas an internal cue says focus on this muscle at the expense of all the other ones involved. And so this is why where coordination is key or coordination is king, the external focus needs to be your guiding light in the dark. So what about an internal focus then? Well, here's where I think it comes into play. An internal focus is best for conditions involving maximal metabolic stress. I'm not talking about conditioning, but I'm talking about building metabolic stress and discomfort inside the muscle, okay, under moderate loading and high fatigue. So I still might utilize an internal focus to generate that fatigue, to generate that metabolic stress. But in conditions where coordination becomes critical at the end or an entire platform is about to come down on my body, an external focus is my lifeline. It's my secondary chute, if you think of it in parachuting terms, okay? An internal focus is the preferred focus during single joint movements, absolutely no issue, and machine-based multi-joint movements. This is where it really starts to come into play. And that's probably a pretty good definition for how a lot of bodybuilding-oriented work is done. And even though I work and have only ever worked in professional sport, we still do a lot of this on pump days, on off days, to stimulate downstream hormonal changes, to promote recovery, to promote localized adaptation. We still do work like this beyond the dumbbell, the barbell, and the functional-based pieces. Okay. So if that's the general blueprint, that's not the exciting part. I could stop, you could walk out of here. Where people always come into challenge with this topic is not their agreeance of it, it's not their identification of it actually in their own coaching blueprint, but it's knowing how to cultivate this skill of cueing and connecting your client to themselves and thereby you to your client. And so what I want to spend the majority of my time on is actually going through the various methods you have at your disposal to bring those concepts to life. Okay? So we have 3 different things we're going to talk about. The first section, which if you've ever heard me present or you have the book, The Language of Coaching, I talk about exhaustively, but we're going to give some examples to make sure we're clear on what this means. So I'm going to go through what targeted use of an external focus during the entire set. How do we do that? Internal focus, targeted use of an internal focus during the entire set, and this concept that I'm now just floating, I'd actually like to do something in the space, write on it a bit more, this combined focus where we start with an internal focus and finish with an external focus. And again, for those of you that were in the practical, we actually went through these as a group. So let's start with the first one. So I've just hand selected a number of movements. And in doing so, I want to start to provide you with the way I think about how you create external cues when it comes to weight room-based movements. So virtually every single movement in the gym can follow this structure, whereby you have cues that are posture-based. Another way to put that is you have setup cues, cues that are literally meant to put them in the right position before they even begin, especially when their body is under load. We then very simply have the cues to work on the lowering phase, the control of that, and cues that target the lifting phase. Now, of these 3 categories, as an industry, where do you think we typically cue the most? Probably the lifting, right? Because that's the dangerous part. If we're going to get anything right, we want to probably get the posture right, and we want to get the lifting part right. But I think it's important to understand that if I don't get the lowering right, if I don't get the position as I come down, it's very difficult to get the lifting part right. So I'm not here to tell you which of these buckets to pull from, but rather that all 3 of them are in play. And you might have 3 different clients that seem to present with the same issue, but the mechanism by which you get them out of that issue may fall in any one of these. So let's just go through a few of these samples here. So for posture, stay long and get strong. Flatten into the bench, stay glued to the bench, stretch from wall to wall. And here we're talking head to knee, stretching or filling the room. And so what I like about these cues is they establish a good, strong foundation before I even begin the lift. And so if you're running out of ideas, if you're running out of concepts of what to say to the person, but you feel like they could be better, but you don't know how, this is a very nice blueprint to scan their movement to see which bucket is your intuition suggesting they need to improve upon and start to actually formulate some language around it. What obviously connects all of these cues is that they are external in nature. They're not necessarily explicitly referencing the body. I do want to be very clear that even when I'm trying to give an external cue, I still will very often open up with an internal description. So I might say, hey, I want you to be stacked. I want your spine to be long from head to knee. Right? That's a bunch of internal language. To do that, I want you to think about gluing your body to the bench. See how I make that move? So I explain what to do using simple, everyday head, shoulders, knees, and toes language. But then I give them the language I'd use having a beer or a cup of coffee. Everyday human language, okay? Glue yourself to the bench. Feel connected, feel strong. See how we do that? So both can be in play even when I'm just trying to give an external focus. If we think about these, they're very biomechanically informed. Pull the dumbbells apart. Pull the dumbbells to the ground. Resist the dumbbells as you lower. Push through the floor. Now, the way you can immediately enhance these is by utilizing a spring analogy. So if you actually tell the person, even if you were to bring over foam rolls, you're not going to literally put them under their elbows. So you see this foam roll? See how it's kind of like a spring? Imagine the shape of a spring, yeah? Okay, I want you to imagine you have heavy, thick, huge springs under your elbows. Drive those springs down, boom, and use that energy as you come up. Even if you run that through your own mental simulator, that's a lot more interesting to a client than bring the dumbbells down and push them back up. Okay? We can freshen this up without changing the exercise at all. I'm going to say it again. How can I meet my exercise each time for the first time? I really like that as a concept to challenge myself as a coach. And then finally, drive the dumbbells toward the ceiling, punch the dumbbells towards the sky, push the dumbbells away from the bench, squeeze the dumbbells together at the top. Again, you could just add in your spring, or say, hey, I want you to imagine that I have resistance bands on your wrists, and those resistance bands are pinned to the walls. I want you to drive away from those resistance bands. Bust through the band, bust through the band. The beauty of this is we're utilizing our capacity for visualization, our capacity for analogy, which is actually how we learn language in the first place, and we're just simply mapping it on learning these movements. And that's the beauty of an external cue. What I want you to play around, and I have whole presentations on this, so I'll just highlight it for now, is my language in the lifting phase can be toward the ceiling, which means it can be away from the bench. Right? So I can play around with those directional differences. Typically, the more I want power, the more I want strength, the more I want a toward cue. Okay? If I'm initially learning the movement, I typically want to keep things closer to me. I might work away, keep it tighter from the bench. It's a general kind of mental spacing piece. If I tell you to push the dumbbells to the ceiling versus punch, does that feel the same to you? Does pushing and punching feel the same to you? Which one's more violent? Which one has more energy? Okay, and that's real. You know how it's real? You couldn't have answered the question if it wasn't. So it's real to them. And so when we look at verbs, which is what those are, action words, verbs are literally processed in the part of the brain that maps to those physical movements or the movements that fall under that verb or verbal category. And so when you say the word punch, the part of the brain that's actually responsible for upper limb coordination of performing that movement is actually the same part of the brain that lights up when they process that word, either hearing it, saying it, writing it, or reading it, honestly. And so in this regard, language is not trivial. This is why when you give someone a cue and they kind of give you that look like they know the thing's going to work before they've even tried it, that's a real thing they're experiencing. There is an internal simulation akin to visualization that goes on that gives you this low-grade muscular responsiveness that then you use to bring it to life when you actually perform the movement. That all comes to life with this type of language, playing around with analogy, playing around with verbs. So then with analogies, here they are. Quite literally, you can load springs. I have some people that have now attended courses that I've run, and they're good artists, and so they'll have a sketch pad with them, or they'll have an iPad with them, and they'll actually draw out overlays on their clients to very good effect. In fact, the person who is the best at, one of the best at it, is the head coach of synchronized swimming. And she's over with the USA team right now in the Olympics. Now, I don't know how they will do, but she literally has an iPad next to the water, and she will overlay various imagery on top of videos and then project it back to the swimmers. And so it looks just like this. And so this is something you can use, and it's why in my book I have this imagery come to life, not just to show the reader, but actually have this be a means by which you can demonstrate things to your clients as well. And so ultimately, I can have you look at that picture and say, that's what I want you to do. I can give you no verbal at all, but the brilliance is an analogy is a verbal demonstration. I'm just going to say that one more time because I like it. Right? An analogy is a verbal demonstration. You say, this is kind of like that. And the way you process the this is kind of like that is not in the literal words, it's the imagery the words promote. And that imagery then allows you to step in and feel the action that imagery promotes. And so it goes from verbal to physical very rapidly. Now, I'm not going to spend as much time on all of these. I do know that this is in the slide deck. So again, here if I'm doing a one-arm row, okay, with or without the leg lifted, again, I have posture, I have the lifting phase, I have the lowering phase. So with the lifting phase, pull to your pocket, pull away from the floor, pull toward the ceiling, pull along a vertical line. People oftentimes will use the same cues over and over again, but there's different ways to freshen it up. One of my favorite things to do is say, hey, I want you to focus on pulling that dumbbell into your pocket. What does that mean to you? And they might say, you want me to pull the dumbbell towards my pocket. Great, we're on the same page. Or they might say, you want me to pull the dumbbell straight up. They might not even realize they made that verbal pivot. But guess what I do? I dance the dance. I pivot too. I'm like, exactly. Pull that dumbbell straight up. And so what's beautiful about a lot of this is like a template. I start with it, and it's like jazz. We riff. right? And I throw them a cue. What does that mean to you? I give them 2 cues. Which one do you prefer? I say, hey, this is what we need to do. What do you think you can think about? And all of a sudden, you have got a lot of raw material. Anyone in this room ever had imposter syndrome as a coach? Feeling like they don't actually deserve? Okay, you probably still have it. I have it every time I present. You're like, I can see why, man. That was a horrible attempt at a joke. See, the Irish do that. They say something that doesn't go down, they make fun of themselves. So now I've totally lost track of what I was talking about there. So what was I talking about there? Jazz. So if we involve them, then they can start to guide us. They can start to guide us towards what makes sense to them. Imposter syndrome. What I find is you have someone who has authentically not been coaching that long. They know their biomechanics, they know their physiology, they have their degree, they have their certifications, they've done great mentorships, but they just haven't had a lot of time on the job. So legitimately, they haven't built up the menu of cues. And so what's awesome is they probably have a few starter cues, and that's good. But I can say, hey, what I want you to do is I want you to pull this dumbbell straight up. What do you think you can focus on, right, to get that nice and high? Or, hey, I want you to lift this weight. What do you think you can focus on to get that dumbbell from the ground to your hip pocket? Okay, now that might be a bad example because it's a pretty simple movement, but you see what I'm pointing to. If I involve the client, if I involve the athlete, ultimately I'm their guide, and where they inevitably take me is the language that makes sense to them. They help me get to the words that work. It's like we're in a quarry and I'm trying to mine them for diamonds, except it's memories, it's experiences, and it's preferences. Okay? So analogies here, again, I want you to imagine there's a wall right behind you. I want you to drag, I want you to drag the dumbbell straight up the wall. I want you to imagine there's a piece of chalk on the back of that dumbbell. I want a straight line up that wall. Right? Oh, the line was a little bit squiggly on the last one. You see how you do that? Analogies allow you to actually start to create a story, and within that story there tends to be parameters that I can play around with, that I can manipulate, that can increase speed, increase force, decrease force, improve directionality. Once I've given a mechanism that talks about alignment, in this case, dragging it up a wall or utilizing a pen example or a chalk example. Okay, and then finally here, a single leg RDL, the demise of most coaches trying to teach this. Again, we have our 3 components, right? Posture, the lowering phase, and the lifting phase. So some of the cues I like to use, right? Lengthen, head to heel, strong as steel. I always say head to heel, strong as steel, 1 meal deal. Why the hell do I say 1 meal deal? Because it rhymes. It has nothing to do with the cue. But because it rhymes, they remember the first part it rhymes with. So I use analogy and alliteration and rhyme almost all the time, right? And I might say to get them on the dime and to keep them on time, and all of a sudden now, bam, locked in. They've got it. And if they're laughing, they're listening and they're understanding. Otherwise, they wouldn't be laughing, right? So I'm trying to all the time look for feedback that things are working here, and rhyme is a great way to do it. Stretch from wall to wall, fill the room, get proud as you hinge, be unbendable as you bow. All these different ways and play on words. People will say, you must have naturally been good at this. I was horrible at this when I started. I felt like an absolute fool. And the amount of times that I have people look at me like, what are you on about, man? You sound like a joker. But in time, everybody else I was the one laughing, because I got to the point where this became like a secret weapon. And you don't need to sit here and think about it. It just comes to you. Your brain immediately is looking for rhymes, connections, and analogical associations with this thing you're teaching to help them understand how to do it better. Okay? So bowing over the bar, bumping the car door as you bow down. My favorite one is put your footprint on the wall behind you. That's a great one that tends to get good length. Head to heel, strong as steel. Imagine I have a chain at your head, a chain on your heel, pulling you, wall to wall. And that's how I coach. I demonstrate where I utilize language to accent the movement. It's like I'm trying to give a narration, right? A narration to the movement that complements. So I will lengthen out certain vowels. I want you to get long as you come down and snap up. And so if we start thinking about, in a way, our coaching in part, because it is, whether or not you know it, as a performance. Not that you're disingenuous, but you are performing, you are engaging. And the level that this is entertainment is the level that ensures you have their attention captured and you're able to put the right things at the right time in the right way in front of them. Okay? So that's external focus. I've talked about that for years. We're now going to get to the new one, an internal focus. Arnie again. So 3 major things here. We want to focus on the muscle, but how we do this matters. How we do this matters. Focus on the muscle, thinking of range of tension versus range of motion. What that means is I am trying to keep, however I'm focusing, tension in the muscle as best I can the entire time, which means I'm not resting. I'm not engaging in positions where the muscle stops working. So range of tension alongside range of motion. Let the muscle move you rather than you moving the muscle. Think about that. When you pick up a dumbbell and you do a bicep curl, where do you have your lived sense of ownership of that movement? I guarantee it's in your hand. You think you are moving this at this point. This is where the force is. This is where it's felt, but this hand, barbell, dumbbell is where I'm doing the work. The reality is every single movement is a pulling movement. Every movement is a pulling movement because the pec attaches on to the humerus, the bicep crosses the shoulder, the elbow. It is pulling my forearm up. But I have the sense that I'm lifting the dumbbell. What we want to do is we want to honor. This is where I think mind-muscle connection goes really high. We want to honor actually what is happening. And so the second I can get to the point in a bicep curl, as an example, where I think of my forearm and my hand as just an additional mass, a mass just like the dumbbell, I would typically use the word, it feels nearly invisible to me. It's external to me, just like the dumbbell is. And I get a general sense of that insertion point. And I allow myself to pull that dumbbell up. It is a vastly different experience than thinking about curling with my energy and attention on my hand. Now, I will lift a heck of a lot more weight if I focus on my hand and the dumbbell. I'll tell you that right now. But in terms of pump, activation, and local muscle fatigue, it's chalk and cheese. Completely 2 different experiences. So the degree to which we're chasing pump, activation, and local fatigue, I bring that attention closer to the muscle belly, and I think of myself as pulling into this position versus lifting into this position. And then this way it relates to the last point. Focus on the relationship between insertion and origin. Know your anatomy. My first experience at 19 or 20, going through a coaching course at Oregon State University, I had this gentleman I worked with named JC. JC, he really liked the sound of his own voice. And not a lot of people liked him except his clients because he was a heck of a coach, but he annoyed all the trainers around him. That's not the story here. The story is I had never met someone. He did everything that everyone else did. He did bench press on Monday. He did biceps try. Nothing was new about his methodology. But I was young, so I didn't have a lot of comparisons. But I had enough comparisons to say, he's doing something different. And what he was doing is how he used his mouth, for better or for worse. How he communicated this stuff. He understood anatomy so well. He was able to bring this concept of muscles always pulling limbs in versus limbs lifting weight. So he would have bodybuilders work with him who would be able to achieve activation in portions of their back and their shoulder and their body that they had struggled to lift, struggled to feel, and thus struggled to develop. And so oddly enough, what got me into coaching and cueing in the first place was actually where we are right now with how to do this. I'm going to give you my best explanation on how you actually literally get into the muscle now. So here we have one of the best bodybuilders in the world. So we'll start with our bicep curl. So what are we doing here? Obviously, clearly, we are trying to flex the elbow. This is the muscle that we're activating. And a lot of people will just focus on the squeeze at the easiest part, which is where? At the top, where it's unavoidably obvious. Do a leg extension at the top. It's easy. But what a bodybuilder will do is will bring that attentional focus to the activation of the muscle through the entire range. How do you do that? they bring their attention to the insertion point. And the way I like to think of it is literally, imagine I have a chain. Imagine I have a string on that point. Everything below that string is like excess mass. It's invisible to me. And I allow the muscle to move me. Just allow that to marinate for a second. You don't move, the muscle moves you. Become an audience member to your activation. I love that idea. I've never said that before. I'm going to write that one down. Audience member to your own activation. So the muscle moves the limb rather than the limb moving the muscle. This is literally inversing and flipping how I would ever coach someone to sprint or do something complex from a coordination perspective. So we flip the mind and everything becomes a pull. And anatomically speaking, everything literally is a pull. For a muscle to shorten, it is pulling on the anatomy, pulling on the bone structure to bring it together or to allow it to go apart. And so I'm taking this concept of the chain, of the string, I'm bringing it to my general understanding of that insertion point, and am I allowing myself to experience? What you tend to find is things slow down, and shaking and twitching tends to go up significantly. And you'll find this is very, very difficult to do. You'll find yourself chasing an external focus as soon as you can get out of this. And so this is where I would encourage you after this to have a play with these concepts, because you will be able to get into a level of muscular torture that you hear bodybuilders talk about, you can observe in their videos, but rarely have us average humans ever felt, okay? And so you allow yourself to entertain it. This is how, whether or not they know they're doing this, I've been doing this long enough and have seen enough, I believe this is how that mind-muscle sense comes to life. They allow the muscle to do the work, they're an audience to their activation. So here if I'm doing a shoulder raise, whether it be straight out or a lateral raise, clearly if it's something external and I'm trying to lift a lot of weight, my energy is going to be on my hand, it's going to be on the dumbbell. But if I actually want to start to get into that anterior delt and absolutely punish it, I'm going to bring that focus as close to that insertion point as possible. And so with my client, I literally might say, I'll find the insertion point. I will point to it. I might even palpate or have them palpate it. I said, at this point, I want you to imagine I have a chain attached to you. We're nice and proud. Allow that chain, allow that chain, allow that muscle to pull, painstakingly pull and elevate your hand to that neutral position or that straight pointed position. And so I'll add language around this, demonstration and emphasis. So we increase activation by shifting lever arm focus closer to the muscle. That's principally what is going on here. We're bringing their focus as close to that insertion point, closer to the muscle as possible, especially with isolated or semi-multi-joint oriented movements. If we think about this, this is just one way to visualize it, but I think the chain analogy is very, very helpful. Oddly enough, usually when you shorten a lever arm, things become easier. But when you shorten the lever arm focus, they become a hell of a lot harder because the lever arm still mechanically is far away from the body. Okay? And then finally here, we can go through a lot of other examples, a lat pull down. So again, if I'm focusing just on the bar, if it's a pull-up, or the barbell, or the attachment here with a pull down, just fine. But inevitably, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get as close to that insertion point, which wraps around on the anterior portion of the humerus. And the way I'm going to get at that with this specific movement is focusing on the elbows. And so here we might talk about dragging the elbows against the wall, dragging or driving the elbows into the pockets, anything that brings those wings down into place. But in this position, what I want you to think about, if I go back just for a moment here, look at my arrows. When I'm doing this motion, I don't just want the elbows coming down. I actually want the elbows cascading out and down. So as far as the athlete or the client is concerned, I'm actually asking them to drive their elbows into the walls, side to side. Drag your elbows into the walls. What that ultimately does is it creates more glenohumeral space. When you stretch a muscle, guess what that muscle does? It fires back. Says, I don't think so, not today. So we talk about the stretch shortening typically purely for fast movements and plyometrics. But if you actually listen to bodybuilders on how they cue, a lot of their cues that are internal focus, yes, are very length-based. So the ability to actually use cues that promote length and space in the joint increases stability and activation, both in the joint, but also in the muscle of interest. So here I not only bring the focus closer to the muscle, the insertion point, but the way I'm bringing that focus is I want you to imagine that chain. That chain is pulling those elbows out and then down, ending elbows in your pockets. Okay? Has anyone noticed that even though I'm anchoring these cues to the body, they still feel very external, don't they? Because I'm bringing a lot of analogy, a chain, a spring, but I'm mapping it on to the body. I actually think there's something about that matters. No
research tips. I've used a lot of it in my own coaching, but I think that's an important non-trivial point, not simply to say activate muscle. I think telling someone to activate your muscle is about as good as to flex the joint. In bringing and mapping this analogy on top of it helps give a sense of how to complete this while getting superior activation. But I'm a TED. So ultimately what we are trying to do is trying to get the person to squeeze, right? The juice out of the lemon, the water out of the sponge. I will utilize these quite a bit as general cues to the individual, right? Don't be a jerk, increase activation by squeezing at the top. Many of your athletes and clients, especially when things start to hurt, that's what they want to do. They go external focus and they speed everything up. Like they want to leave the fun section and have the whole simply come back on board. But if my purpose is to get low muscle fatigue, activation, whatever the pain chain, and torture that one area of the body to get growth and adaptation, I want to kind of keep them in that internal localized state of mind as long as possible. Which is why we talk about being eliminating this. I love coming up with phrases that we can just throw at people, get them excited, trigger into alignment where they need to be. So it's all our squeeze, let's adjourning this at the end of the potion. Okay, finally here, a combined focus. Sorry about Tadia, the ones that were community wide. So combined focus is this. And this is the one I'd really encourage you to play around with on movements that meet our internal focus criteria. You start with an internal focus. So here I literally might imagine that I have a chain right down here and I am just squeeze, lemonade for everybody. And I'm going to say that to client, lemonade for everybody. Here we go, selling it on the street. Let's keep it going, And right, why is there? I would say right when they're within 2 to 3 reps of failure, right? The white flag has gone up. Boom, shift them to an external focus and you finish it off. And I guarantee they will get more than 2 to 3 reps out of that external focus. And that's how you go. And so this way you can play around with, hey, I want you to stay internal as long as you can, utilizing whatever analogy or visualization you get. And the second it's too much, I want you right back into the dump, right back into the ground, whatever that might be. And again, only if the movement meets the criteria and you're chasing these specific outcomes. While I'm walking out and saying, in news, internal focus is the new externally. No, it's not that. Not that. It's an and, not an O. Absolutely. So, like those. Yeah, please. Then it will do 6 weeks. Yeah, no, 64. You know, ratio or is the yes. McCarthy, help. Well, please, that for the stomach. That's for Yep. Some it's so what do I get? It's I got so in the bar. Yep, I'm bar so exactly. And you'll be able to come with that kind of pairing, mental pairing for any of the movements that you want to apply. Exactly. So almost if you go that external focus category, say, okay, I'm going to use that external focus, and the internal, I'm going to use that internal focus. You start with the internal. The second they can't do them both, right in that external focus. Exactly. The other 100%. So I'll finish with this and then I'll take any additional questions. So it is the greatest feeling. I search for this pump because it means that my muscles will grow. Muscle become tight. like skin is going to explode any minute. It's like someone is putting air into my muscles. I like this last point because ultimately, an overarching visual you can use is allow every single repetition to be a deep breath into the muscle. And every repetition be a deep breath into the muscle to allow it to fill. This is the concept, again, that goes with everything we're talking about, which is as a final overarching one to play around with in the same way you might with the lemonade, I think is a really interesting one. Because that pump ultimately represents the metabolic routine that we know internal cues are best designed to help promote within the context of the condition we outlined today, in and around the muscle. I'm done. Good. I think there's hopefully a few copies of that still out there. Any of my information that is relevant is right there. This presentation has not been done before. It is addressed in the book. All the cues are in the book, but not to this detail. Future editions of this will likely bring greater fully talking about today.